Power doesn't collapse in a moment. It erodes in silence, until the one person you underestimated decides to speak without saying a word. The boardroom on the 47th floor of Whitmore Tower had always been a place where decisions shaped cities and fortunes shifted with a single vote. But tonight, the air felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. And at the head of the long glass table sat Ethan Whitmore, the man who had built an empire from steel resolve and calculated risk. His tailored charcoal suit immaculate, his silver cufflinks catching the soft glow of the recessed lighting, every detail of him designed to project control, dominance, certainty. Yet beneath that polished exterior, something restless flickered in his gray eyes, something he couldn't quite name, because for the first time in years, the room wasn't responding to him the way it always had. The board members seated around him exchanged glances that were too careful, too measured, and the silence stretching between them wasn't the respectful kind he commanded. It was the kind that comes before a shift, before a fall, before truth finds its way into the light whether invited or not. "Let's proceed," Ethan said, his voice steady, controlled, the same voice that had closed billion-dollar deals and dismantled competitors without ever raising its tone. But as his assistant dimmed the lights and the presentation screen flickered to life, a subtle ripple moved through the room, a tension that didn't belong to him. And then it appeared, a single name projected in clean white letters against the dark screen. Naomi Carter. The letters simple, almost understated, yet they landed with a weight that made Ethan's fingers pause against the edge of the table, just for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but enough to betray that something inside him had shifted, because that name wasn't supposed to be here, not now, not ever again. And yet there it was, undeniable, unignorable, written into the very structure of the meeting that was supposed to reaffirm his control, not challenge it. "Who authorized this?" he asked, his tone still calm, but edged with something sharper, something closer to confusion than anger, because confusion was more dangerous. Confusion meant he didn't have all the information, and Ethan Whitmore was a man who always had all the information, or at least he believed he did, until this moment, until now, when the board chairman, a man who had once deferred to him without hesitation, leaned forward slightly, his expression composed, almost sympathetic, and said, "It's already been authorized, Ethan." And just like that, the ground beneath years of certainty shifted, not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, precisely, the way real power moves, the way real consequences unfold, without spectacle, without warning, and the presentation advanced, revealing a series of acquisitions, investments, strategic partnerships that had been building for years, hidden in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of Whitmore Industries. And with each slide, each number, each connection, the picture became clearer, sharper, undeniable. Someone had been inside his system, not hacking it, not attacking it, but becoming part of it, piece by piece, decision by decision, until there was no clear line between his empire and theirs. And at the center of it all, like a quiet axis around which everything turned, was that same name, Naomi Carter. And for a moment, the room seemed to fade, the polished table, the muted city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the subtle hum of the air conditioning, all of it receding as memory pressed forward, uninvited, unwelcome, a flash of a different night, a different kind of silence, one filled with something he had chosen not to understand at the time, because it had been easier to dismiss. Easier to believe that silence meant weakness, that absence meant defeat, that walking away meant losing. And now, as the boardroom filled with the quiet certainty of decisions already made, already sealed, Ethan realized the cost of that assumption, realized that silence had never meant surrender, not for her, not for Naomi, because somewhere in the years he had spent expanding his empire, she had been doing the same, just not in a way he could see, not in a way he could control. And as the final slide settled into place, showing the transfer of controlling interest, the irreversible shift of power, the chairman spoke again, his voice steady, almost gentle, effective immediately. The board recognizes the majority stakeholder, and the words hung in the air, precise, final, leaving no room for negotiation, no room for reversal. and for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Whitmore understood what it meant to be on the other side of inevitability, to watch as something he believed unbreakable redefined itself without his permission. And then, as if the moment itself had been waiting for her, the doors at the far end of the boardroom opened, not dramatically, not forcefully, just enough to draw every eye in the room. And there she was, Naomi Carter, standing in the doorway in a black dress that moved like quiet authority, her posture composed, her expression unreadable, the years etched into her presence not as weight, but as refinement, as strength sharpened over time. And as she stepped forward, the soft click of her heels against the marble floor echoing just enough to mark each step, each second, each undeniable truth, Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not panic, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes too late to change anything, the kind that arrives only after the game has already been won. And as Naomi reached the table, her gaze meeting his for the first time in years, there were no accusations in her eyes, no anger, no need to explain, only a quiet certainty that said everything that needed to be said without a single word. And in that silence, Ethan finally understood she had never needed to fight him. She had only needed to wait. The room did not applaud. It did not erupt. It simply shifted, like a tide that had already decided its direction long before anyone noticed the water moving. And as Naomi Carter took her place at the far end of the table, she did not sit immediately. She let the silence stretch just enough to remind everyone present that control was no longer an assumption but a fact. Her gaze moving across the board members with quiet precision, acknowledging each of them without seeking approval, without needing validation, because the numbers had already spoken for her. The structure had already bent in her favor, and the only thing left now was acknowledgement. "You built something remarkable, Ethan," she said finally, her voice calm, even, carrying no trace of bitterness, only clarity. And that was what unsettled him most. Not anger, not accusation, but the absence of both, because he had prepared himself, somewhere deep down, for confrontation, for raised voices, for something he could push against, something he could counter, but there was nothing here to fight, only truth standing in front of him in a form he no longer recognized. "And you let me help you," she continued, her words measured, each one placed with intention. "You just never realized how much." A faint movement passed through the room, subtle, but present, as the board members absorbed what that meant. Not just a takeover, not just a strategic maneuver, but a presence that had been there all along, woven into decisions, partnerships, expansions. And for the first time since she walked in, Ethan leaned back in his chair, not in relaxation, but in recalibration, his mind moving quickly, connecting pieces, reviewing years of data, faces, meetings, trying to locate the exact moment where control had slipped. But the truth was more unsettling than any single point of failure. There was no moment, no single misstep, only a gradual shift he had never considered because it had not looked like a threat. It had looked like support, like alignment, like growth. "You were never on the board," he said, his voice quieter now, not weaker, but more focused, searching, and Naomi allowed a small pause before answering, just enough to let the question settle. "No," she said, "I was not." And then, almost gently, "I did not need to be." The statement landed with a quiet finality, not a boast, not a challenge, just a fact. And that was when the past began to surface more clearly, not as a single memory, but as a sequence, fragments aligning, moments he had dismissed at the time, now reassembling into something coherent, something undeniable. The night at the gala, the one he had not thought about in years, the one he had categorized as a necessary distraction, a minor deviation in an otherwise controlled life. The soft lighting, the music that blended into the background, the conversations that meant nothing. And then Naomi, standing near the edge of the room, not trying to be seen, not trying to belong, just present, composed. And he remembered noticing her not because she demanded attention, but because she did not. There had been a steadiness to her, something that did not bend under the weight of the room, something that did not seek approval from it. And for a brief moment, he had been curious enough to approach, to speak, to engage in a conversation that had felt different from the others, not because of what was said, but because of what was not, she had listened more than she spoke, observed more than she revealed, and when she did respond, her words had been precise, thoughtful, not designed to impress, but to understand, and he had mistaken that. Mistaken her silence for simplicity, her calm for lack of ambition, her presence for something temporary, something that would fade once the night ended. And perhaps that had been his first mistake, not the betrayal itself, not the decisions that followed, but the assumption that someone quiet could not be powerful, that someone who did not compete in his way was not competing at all. And as the boardroom returned into focus, the weight of that assumption settled into something heavier, something that could not be undone. Naomi moved then, finally taking a seat, her hands resting lightly on the table, not gripping, not claiming, just existing with a confidence that did not require display. "You always believed control had to be visible," she said, her eyes meeting his again, steady, unwavering. "That if you could see it, you could manage it." She tilted her head slightly, not in judgment, but in reflection. But the most effective changes happen where no one is looking. There was no triumph in her tone, no satisfaction, only a quiet acknowledgement of a truth she had lived for years, and Ethan understood then, not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to recognize that what stood before him was not the woman he had once known, not the version he had defined by a single moment, but someone who had taken that moment and transformed it into something far beyond his reach. And for the first time, the question that formed in his mind was not how to fix this, not how to reverse it, but how he had failed to see it coming. And the answer, though unspoken, lingered between them, clear, undeniable. He had never truly looked. The silence did not break after her words. It deepened, stretching across the glass table like a reflection no one could avoid. And for a moment, no one spoke because there was nothing left to debate. The outcome had already been decided long before this meeting ever began. Yet Ethan Whitmore was not a man who surrendered to silence easily. He studied it, measured it, searched for the fracture point where control could be reasserted. And as he leaned forward again, his fingers interlocking with deliberate calm, his voice returned with that same controlled precision that had once commanded the room without resistance. "You had access," he said, not as an accusation, but as a calculation. "Partnerships, capital flow, strategic positioning, none of that happens without proximity." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. "So tell me, Naomi, when did it start?" And for the first time, there was a shift in the room that did not belong to him, a subtle pull toward her, because now the question was not about power, it was about origin, about the unseen beginning of something that had grown beyond his control. And Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the question settle, let the weight of it fill the space, not as hesitation, but as intention, because timing, like everything else she had built, was precise. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same quiet clarity that had defined her presence from the moment she walked in. "It started the night you stopped listening," she said, and the words were simple, almost understated, yet they carried a depth that shifted the air in the room, because they were not tied to a date, not anchored to a transaction or a deal, but to a moment, a choice, a turning point that could not be quantified on any balance sheet. And before Ethan could respond, before he could dissect or redirect, the memory unfolded, not just for him, but for her, clear and complete. The gala years ago, the same one he had begun to recall, but now seen from a different angle, a different truth. Naomi standing near the edge of the ballroom, her dress understated but elegant, the deep black fabric catching light only when it moved, never demanding attention, only reflecting it when necessary. She had not been there to impress anyone, not there to belong to that world, but she had been invited, not as a guest of status, but as a consultant, a financial analyst whose work had quietly supported one of the firms Ethan had recently partnered with. She had spent the evening observing, listening, mapping the patterns of influence that flowed through the room like an unspoken language. And when Ethan approached her, it had not been because she stood out in the way others tried to. It was because she did not, because her stillness created a contrast he could not ignore. Their conversation had been brief, efficient. He had asked questions expecting conventional answers, and she had responded with insights that were neither excessive nor insufficient, just exact. And for a moment, there had been a recognition, not emotional, not personal, but intellectual, a brief alignment of perspective, and then it passed, because for Ethan, that night was only one of many, a series of interactions that blended into the larger rhythm of his world. But for Naomi, it marked something else, not because of what was said, but because of what followed, the subtle shift in his attention, the way his focus moved elsewhere, drawn to something more visible, more immediate, something that fit more easily into the structure of his expectations. And she had watched, not with resentment, not with pain in that moment, but with understanding, because what she saw was not just a personal choice. It was a pattern, a reflection of how he moved through the world, how he evaluated value, how he determined what mattered and what did not. And in that quiet observation, something in her perspective changed, not shattered, not broken, just realigned. And she stepped back, not dramatically, not in protest, but in decision, choosing not to remain in a space where she would be defined by someone else's limitations, choosing instead to build something of her own, something that did not rely on recognition from a system that had never truly seen her. And as the memory dissolved back into the present, the boardroom came into focus again, the city lights beyond the windows now brighter, sharper, reflecting off the glass surfaces like fragments of something newly revealed. You were looking for something obvious, Naomi continued, her gaze steady on Ethan. Something that fit your version of power. She paused briefly, not for effect, but for clarity. I was building something else. The statement settled into the room with quiet certainty, and Ethan understood then that this was not a reaction, not a response to a single moment of betrayal, but a trajectory, a path she had chosen long before he ever realized it, a path that had intersected with his not by accident, but by design, and for the first time, the full scope of it began to take shape in his mind, not as a series of events, but as a structure, one that had grown alongside his own, unnoticed because it did not compete in the same way. And that was what made it effective, what made it inevitable. And as he sat there, surrounded by the quiet acknowledgement of a reality he could no longer control, one thought surfaced with undeniable clarity. This had never been about revenge. It had always been about vision, and he had never seen hers until it was too late. The weight of realization did not arrive all at once. It settled in layers, quiet and undeniable. And as the boardroom remained suspended in that controlled stillness, Ethan Whitmore felt something unfamiliar take shape beneath his composure. Not panic, not yet, but the unmistakable awareness that the rules he had relied on no longer applied. And across from him, Naomi Carter did not move to claim victory. She did not lean forward or assert dominance. She simply remained exactly as she was, composed, grounded, her presence carrying a certainty that did not need reinforcement. And that contrast, more than anything else, shifted the balance of the room, because power that demands attention can be challenged, but power that exists without needing acknowledgement cannot be undone. You built your empire on visibility, Naomi said, her voice steady, almost reflective, as if she were describing something already concluded rather than something unfolding in real time. Every move announced, every success displayed, every decision reinforced by recognition. She paused briefly, her gaze drifting for a fraction of a second toward the city skyline beyond the glass, the lights stretching for miles, each one a symbol of ambition, of expansion, of control. And it worked, she added, not dismissing it, not diminishing it, but acknowledging it as fact. And Ethan followed her line of sight for just a moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, because he knew she was right. He had built everything in the open, in boardrooms like this, in headlines, in acquisitions that reshaped industries and confirmed his position at the top. And for years, that visibility had been his strength, his shield, his proof. But visibility also creates patterns, Naomi continued, turning her attention back to him, her eyes clear, unwavering. And patterns can be studied. There was no accusation in her tone, only observation, and that was what made it impossible to deflect, because she was not attacking him. She was explaining him, breaking down the very system he had relied on into something simpler, something predictable, something that could be understood and, eventually, redirected. And as the words settled, the fragments of the past began to align more sharply in Ethan's mind. Not just the gala, not just that single moment of dismissal he had long since buried under more pressing priorities, but everything that followed, the recommendations that had come through from smaller firms he had barely noticed, the analysts whose reports had been precise, unusually insightful, the partnerships that had seemed almost effortless, aligning perfectly with his strategic goals without requiring excessive negotiation. And now, looking back, there was a thread connecting all of it, subtle, consistent, invisible only because he had never thought to look for it. And that realization carried a weight far greater than any immediate loss, because it meant that what he was facing now was not the result of a single miscalculation, but of years of overlooked signals, years of underestimating something that had been growing right alongside him. "You studied my company," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, not in dominance, but in focus, as if he were speaking not just to her, but to the structure she had built around him. And Naomi gave the smallest inclination of her head, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement. "I understood it," she corrected gently, and that distinction, though subtle, was absolute, because study implies distance, observation from the outside, but understanding implies integration, presence within, and that was what shifted the meaning entirely. She had not been watching from afar, she had been inside the movement of it, aligning with it, shaping it in ways that never triggered resistance because they never appeared as opposition. "You were never competing with me," Ethan said, the realization forming fully now, each piece locking into place with quiet precision. And for the first time, there was no edge of challenge in his tone, no attempt to reclaim control, only recognition. And Naomi met that realization without triumph, without satisfaction, only with the same calm clarity that had defined her from the beginning. "No," she said, "I was building where you were not looking." The statement settled into the room with finality, and in that moment, the difference between them became undeniable. Ethan had expanded outward, dominating markets, acquiring visible assets, reinforcing his position through scale and presence, while Naomi had moved differently, not outward, but inward, identifying the spaces between decisions, the overlooked connections, the quiet intersections where influence could grow without drawing attention. And as that contrast sharpened, the shift in power no longer felt sudden. It felt inevitable, like something that had been set in motion long before either of them fully understood its outcome. And the board members, though silent, were no longer uncertain. Their attention had moved completely, not in allegiance, but in acknowledgement of where authority now resided. And Ethan saw it, not in their expressions, but in their stillness, in the absence of the subtle deference they had once given him without question. And that absence, more than anything else, confirmed what the numbers had already declared. "So this was never about one moment," he said, almost to himself, the words carrying a weight that extended beyond the room, beyond the present, reaching back into the past he had chosen not to examine. And Naomi allowed a brief silence before responding, giving the thought space to settle, to take its full shape. "Moments matter," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "But only if you understand what they reveal." She held his gaze, not with confrontation, but with truth. "You revealed everything I needed to know." And there it was, not an accusation, not a judgment, but a conclusion, one that had been drawn years ago and carried forward with precision, with patience, with an understanding that did not rush toward outcome, but moved steadily toward it. And as the city lights reflected across the glass table between them, splitting into fragments of gold and shadow, Ethan Whitmore finally saw the full scope of what had happened, not just the loss of control, not just the shift of power, but the quiet, deliberate construction of something he had never recognized until it stood directly in front of him, complete, undeniable, and entirely beyond his reach. The room did not move, but something within it had already shifted beyond repair, and as the final layer of understanding settled into place, Ethan Whitmore exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that arrives when resistance no longer serves a purpose, when clarity replaces denial. And across from him, Naomi Carter remained exactly as she had been from the moment. She entered, steady, composed, untouched by the tension that now filled the space like an invisible weight pressing against every surface. And for a brief moment, the years between them seemed to collapse, not in memory, but in meaning, because what stood before him was not just the result of strategy, it was the consequence of something far more precise, something that had been shaped not by reaction, but by restraint. "You never said anything," Ethan said finally, his voice quieter than before, stripped of the authority that had once defined it, not broken, but altered, as if each word now carried more weight than it used to. Not then, not after. His gaze held hers, searching not for an advantage, but for an answer that could explain the silence he had once dismissed so easily. And Naomi considered him for a moment, not with hesitation, but with intention. Because this question was not about the past alone, it was about understanding the difference between who she had been and who she had chosen to become. "What would you have heard?" she asked, her tone calm, not confrontational, and the question did not demand a response. It revealed one, because both of them knew the truth embedded within it, that words spoken in the wrong space, to the wrong perspective, rarely change anything. They only echo and disappear. And for a moment, Ethan said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would undo that truth, nothing that could reshape the version of himself that had existed in that moment years ago, the one who had listened only to what aligned with his expectations, who had measured value through visibility, who had mistaken quiet strength for absence. And Naomi continued, not to press, not to prove, but to complete the thought. "I did not need you to understand me," she said, her voice steady, grounded in something deeper than emotion. "I needed to understand myself." The distinction settled into the room with quiet clarity, because it shifted the entire narrative away from him, away from his choices, his actions, his perception, and placed it entirely within her control, her decision, her growth. And that was what made it unchangeable, because it had never depended on him in the first place. And as the board members remained still, their attention no longer divided, no longer uncertain, Ethan felt the final piece of the realization settle into place, not as loss, but as perspective, because what he was witnessing was not just the fall of an empire, it was the emergence of something he had never accounted for, something that did not follow the same rules he had built his world upon. And for the first time, the question that surfaced in his mind was not about recovery, not about strategy, but about recognition. "You could have come back," he said, the words carrying a quiet weight, not as a plea, but as an observation. "You could have taken everything sooner." And Naomi allowed a small, almost imperceptible pause before responding, not to create tension, but to honor the truth of what she was about to say. "I was not interested in taking," she said, her gaze steady, unwavering. "I was interested in building." And there it was again, that difference, that shift in approach that he had never fully understood until now. Because for Ethan, power had always been something to acquire, to expand, to dominate. But for Naomi, it had been something to create, to refine, to sustain. And that difference had defined everything that followed, every decision, every move, every moment of silence that had once seemed insignificant and now revealed itself as intentional, strategic, necessary. "And now," Ethan said slowly, the words forming not as a challenge, but as acceptance, "you have both." And Naomi did not deny it, did not confirm it. She simply let the statement exist, because acknowledgement was no longer required. The reality spoke for itself, and as she rose from her seat, her movement smooth, unhurried, the room seemed to recalibrate around her, not because she demanded it, but because it aligned with her presence, with the quiet authority she carried without effort. And for a brief moment, her gaze moved past Ethan, toward the city beyond the glass, the lights stretching endlessly into the distance, a reflection of something larger than either of them, something that continued regardless of who stood at the center of it. And when she looked back at him, there was no anger in her expression, no trace of the past that had once connected them, only a calm clarity that marked the end of something that had long since been decided. "This was never about destroying you," she said, her voice soft, but certain, each word placed with precision. "You did that the moment you chose not to see." The statement settled into the room like a final note, not loud, not forceful, but complete. and as she turned toward the door, her steps measured, steady, leaving behind the space that no longer belonged to him. Ethan Whitmore remained where he was, not because he could not move, but because for the first time, movement did not offer a solution, did not promise control, did not change the outcome. And in that stillness, surrounded by the quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had been revealed, he understood something he had never allowed himself to consider before, that the most significant shifts do not happen in the moments we recognize. They happen in the ones we overlook, the ones we dismiss, the ones we choose not to understand, until they return, fully formed, undeniable, and far beyond our ability to change them. The door closed behind Naomi Carter with a softness that felt louder than any declaration, and for a moment, no one in the boardroom moved, not because they were waiting for instruction, but because something fundamental had shifted, something that did not require immediate action to be understood, and Ethan Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table that no longer belonged to him, his posture still composed, his expression still controlled, but the authority that once defined both had quietly dissolved into something else, something less certain, something more reflective, and as the silence settled deeper into the room, the board members began to gather their documents, not hurried, not chaotic, just deliberate, their movements no longer orbiting him, no longer seeking alignment with his decisions, but instead following a new center of gravity that had already left the room, and that absence, more than anything else, confirmed what had just taken place, not a confrontation, not a battle, but a transition, seamless and irreversible, and Ethan watched it unfold with a clarity that felt almost detached, as if he were observing the final scene of a story he had once believed he was writing, only to realize he had been part of a narrative he never fully understood. And as the last of the board members exited, leaving the room quiet, expansive, almost unfamiliar, he remained still for a few seconds longer, his gaze drifting toward the city beyond. The glass, the skyline unchanged, the lights still steady, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred 47 floors above the ground. And for the first time in years, the view did not feel like confirmation of his success. It felt like a reminder of how much he had overlooked while chasing it. And slowly, deliberately, he stood, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve out of habit rather than necessity, the gesture automatic, a remnant of a version of himself that no longer fit the moment. And as he turned toward the exit, his reflection caught briefly in the polished surface of the glass wall, not distorted, not broken, just different, as if something essential had been removed, leaving behind only what remained when certainty was stripped away. And when he stepped out into the hallway, the world beyond the boardroom continued as it always had, assistants moving between offices, quiet conversations unfolding behind closed doors, the rhythm of an empire still in motion. But now, that motion no longer belonged to him, and the realization did not come with panic or urgency. It came with a steady, almost unsettling calm, because there was nothing immediate to fix, nothing to negotiate, nothing to reclaim in the way he had always done before. And as he walked toward the elevator, his steps measured, his expression unchanged, a single question surfaced in his mind, not about what he had lost, but about what he had failed to recognize when it mattered. And as the elevator doors opened and closed with a soft chime, descending floor by floor, the memory returned again, not fragmented this time, but complete. The night at the gala, the moment he had turned his attention elsewhere, the quiet dismissal he had not even registered as significant. And now, seen through the clarity of everything that had followed, that moment no longer felt small. It felt defining, not because of what he did, but because of what it revealed about how he saw the world, how he chose what mattered, how he determined value. And as the elevator reached the ground floor and the door slid open, the lobby stretched before him in polished marble and soft lighting, familiar yet distant. And without hesitation, he stepped outside into the evening air, the cool breeze carrying the distant hum of the city, grounding, steady, real. And for a moment, he simply stood there, no longer at the center of anything, no longer surrounded by expectation or deference, just a man standing on the sidewalk of a city that had never truly belonged to him. And as the traffic lights shifted from red to green, cars moving forward in quiet coordination, he understood something that had been invisible to him for years, that control is not measured by how much you hold, but by how deeply you understand what you are building. And for all his success, for all his expansion, he had built outward, faster, larger, louder, while Naomi had built inward, quieter, stronger, beyond the reach of anything he could see or predict. And that difference had shaped everything. And now, standing there with nothing immediate to command, nothing left to prove, Ethan Whitmore felt the weight of that understanding settle into something unfamiliar, not regret in the way he had once defined it, but something closer to clarity, the kind that arrives when the noise fades and what remains can no longer be ignored. And as he finally began to walk, not toward a destination he controlled, but simply forward, the city lights reflecting in the glass of passing buildings, he realized that the empire he lost had not been taken from him in a single moment. It had been slipping away in every moment he chose not to see what was right in front of him. And now, for the first time, there was nothing left to distract him from that truth. The city did not pause for reflection. It never had. And as Ethan Whitmore moved through the evening streets, the rhythm of Manhattan continued around him with quiet indifference. Taxis weaving through traffic, conversations spilling from open restaurant doors, the distant echo of footsteps against concrete sidewalks. All of it steady, all of it unchanged. And yet something within him had shifted in a way that made every familiar detail feel slightly out of place, as if he were seeing it for the first time without the filter of control, without the illusion that everything moving around him somehow belonged to him. And for years he had walked these streets with purpose, every step aligned with a decision, every destination tied to an outcome. But tonight, there was no destination waiting to reinforce his identity, no boardroom expecting his presence, no assistant anticipating his next command. Only the quiet continuity of a world that moved forward regardless of who stood at the center of it. And that realization settled into him not as discomfort, but as clarity, the kind that strips away distraction and leaves only what remains when everything else has been removed. And as he passed the reflection of himself in a storefront window, the image looking back was familiar in form but different in meaning. The tailored suit, the composed posture, the steady expression, all still intact, yet no longer carrying the same weight, no longer defining the man within them. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed the silence to remain without filling it, without reaching for a solution or a strategy to reclaim what had been lost, because there was nothing immediate to reclaim, only something to understand. And that understanding did not come from action, it came from stillness, from allowing the truth he had avoided for years to finally take shape without resistance. And somewhere across the city, in a space far removed from the glass towers and controlled environments that had once defined his world, Naomi Carter stood by a window that did not overlook an empire, but something quieter, something more intentional, the soft glow of interior lighting reflecting against polished wood and clean lines, a space designed not for display, but for clarity. And she did not watch the city with ownership or detachment, she observed it with understanding. The same way she had always approached the world, not by trying to control its movement, but by learning its patterns, its rhythms, its unspoken structures. And as she rested her hand lightly against the edge of the desk beside her, her thoughts did not linger on the boardroom she had just left, did not replay the moment of transition or the quiet acknowledgement of power shifting into her hands, because for her, that moment had already passed long before it arrived. It had been decided in the years of preparation, in the countless small decisions that had built towards something larger than any single event. And as she turned away from the window, moving through the space with the same measured calm that had defined her presence earlier, there was no sense of triumph in her movements, no urgency to assert what had already been established, only a quiet continuation of something that had never been about proving anything to anyone else. And back on the street, Ethan slowed his pace as he reached an intersection, the traffic light shifting from red to green with mechanical precision, the flow of cars resuming without hesitation. And for a moment, he remained still on the curb, watching the movement unfold, not analyzing it, not calculating its patterns, just observing it as it was. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced, not sudden, not forced, but steady, as if it had been waiting beneath everything else for the right moment to emerge, that perhaps the greatest mistake he had made was not in a single decision, not in a moment of distraction or misjudgment, but in the belief that power had to be seen to exist, that if something did not demand attention, it did not require understanding, and that belief had shaped everything, had guided every choice, every evaluation, every assumption about what mattered and what did not, and now, standing there with nothing left to command, nothing left to reinforce that belief, he could see the cost of it with a clarity that left no room for denial. And as he finally stepped forward, crossing the street with the quiet flow of the city around him, there was no immediate answer to what came next, no clear path waiting to be followed. But for the first time, that absence did not feel like failure. It felt like possibility. Not the kind defined by expansion or control, but the kind that begins when everything familiar has been stripped away and what remains is no longer shaped by what was expected. And somewhere within that unfamiliar space, something began to shift, not outward, not visible, but inward, subtle, precise, the beginning of a change that could not be measured by the standards he had once relied on. And as the city lights stretched endlessly ahead of him, reflecting in the glass of passing buildings, Ethan Whitmore continued forward, no longer at the center of an empire, but, perhaps, for the first time, beginning to understand what it meant to see beyond one. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet transition that does not announce itself, but reveals what has already changed. And as the first light moved across the glass surfaces of the city, Naomi Carter stood in a space that reflected none of the excess she had once observed from a distance. No towering skyline view demanding attention, no polished symbols of dominance placed for display. Only clean lines, warm light, and an intentional stillness that allowed every decision made within it to exist without distraction. And as she moved through the room, the soft sound of her footsteps carried a rhythm that was not hurried, not reactive, but aligned with something deeper, something she had built over time without needing validation from the outside world. And on the desk before her, a series of documents lay organized with quiet precision, reports, projections, partnerships, not as trophies of achievement, but as tools of continuation, because for Naomi, the moment in the boardroom had never been the destination. It had been a transition point, one that closed a chapter she had outgrown long before it ended, and opened another that required the same clarity, the same discipline, the same refusal to be defined by anything other than her own understanding of value. And as she paused for a moment, her reflection faintly visible in the glass surface beside her, there was no trace of the woman who had once stood at the edge of a ballroom waiting to be seen, not because that version had been erased, but because it had evolved into something that no longer required recognition to exist. And across the city, Ethan Whitmore sat in a space that once carried the weight of his authority, but now felt strangely neutral. His private office no longer his access already transitioned, the systems that once responded instantly to his presence now operating without it. And the quiet hum of that absence was more profound than any confrontation could have been, because it confirmed what he had begun to understand the night before. That power, once shifted, does not echo backward. It simply continues forward in a new direction. And as he leaned back slightly in the chair across from a desk that no longer belonged to him, his gaze moved across the room not with ownership, but with observation, taking in details he had long overlooked, the subtle imperfections in the design, the elements chosen for appearance rather than function, the decisions made to impress rather than to endure. And for the first time, he saw them not as markers of success, but as reflections of a mindset that had prioritized visibility over substance, expansion over depth. And as that awareness settled into him, it did not come with immediate regret, but with something quieter, something more precise, the recognition that the foundation he had trusted had always contained the seeds of its own instability, because it had been built to be seen, not to be understood. And as he stood and walked toward the window, the city stretching endlessly before him, he no longer saw it as something to conquer, something to dominate, but as something far more complex, far more intricate, a system of movement and connection that could not be controlled from a single vantage point. And in that shift of perspective, something within him began to recalibrate, not in the way he was used to, not through strategy or force, but through acceptance, through the willingness to see what had always been there without trying to reshape it to fit his expectations. And back in her space, Naomi reached for one of the documents on her desk, reviewing it with the same attention she had always given to every detail, every line, every implication, because the discipline that had carried her to this point did not end with success. It continued beyond it, shaping what came next with the same quiet precision that had defined everything before. And as she set the document down, her gaze lifting briefly toward the light filtering through the window, there was no need to reflect on what had been left behind, no need to revisit the past that had once defined her starting point, because she had already taken from it what she needed, the understanding, the clarity, the decision to build differently. And as the city moved into the full light of day, its energy rising, its pace accelerating, both of them stepped forward into spaces that no longer mirrored each other, no longer connected by the same trajectory. And while one moved from loss into understanding, the other moved from completion into continuation. And neither path required the other to define it, because the most significant shift had already taken place, not in the boardroom, not in the transfer of control, but in the quiet decisions made long before either of them realized where those decisions would lead. And now, as the day unfolded with its usual certainty, the difference between them was no longer a matter of position or power, but of perspective, one shaped by what had been overlooked, the other by what had been understood, and in that difference, the future had already begun to take form. The city settled into evening again, not as a repetition of what had been, but as a continuation of something already transformed, and as the sky shifted from pale gold to deep blue, the lights across Manhattan came alive one by one, each window a quiet story unfolding behind glass. And in one of those spaces, Naomi Carter stood once more by the window, not to reflect, not to revisit, but simply to exist within the life she had built without needing to measure it against anything that came before. And there was a calm in her presence that did not seek recognition, a steadiness that did not fluctuate with circumstance, because what she carried was not the result of a single moment, not the outcome of a single decision, but the accumulation of years lived with intention, with discipline, with an understanding that had never depended on being acknowledged by anyone else. And as she turned away from the window, her phone resting quietly on the desk, the notifications that would have once defined importance now held no urgency, because the most significant changes in her life had never come from what demanded attention. They had come from what she chose to build when no one was watching. And across the city, Ethan Whitmore stood at the edge of a different kind of view, not from a towering office or a carefully curated space, but from the sidewalk outside a smaller building where the reflections in the glass did not distort reality, did not elevate or diminish it, only showed it as it was. And for a moment, he remained there, his hands in his pockets, his posture no longer defined by expectation. And as people passed by, moving with purpose, with distraction, with lives entirely separate from his own, he felt something that had been unfamiliar to him for most of his life, a sense of separation not from loss, but from illusion, because for the first time, he was not being seen as a position, not being acknowledged as a title, not being recognized for anything beyond his presence. And that absence of recognition did not diminish him, it clarified him, stripping away everything that had once defined his value in the eyes of others, and leaving only what remained when those definitions no longer applied. And as he looked up at the reflection of the city in the glass before him, the realization that had been forming since the boardroom settled into something complete, something that did not need to be spoken to exist, that the empire he had lost had never truly been the source of his identity. It had been the framework through which he understood himself, and now, without it, he was left with the opportunity to understand something else, something he had never taken the time to explore, and that understanding did not come with immediate answers. It came with space, with the kind of quiet that allows new perspectives to take shape without forcing them into old patterns. And as he stepped forward, entering the building not as a man reclaiming something, but as someone beginning to see differently, the movement was small, almost unremarkable, yet it carried a significance that did not need to be announced, because change, real change, rarely does. And back in her space, Naomi gathered the final document from her desk, placing it neatly into its designated place, her movements precise, unhurried, aligned with the same rhythm that had guided her through every stage of her journey. And as she paused for a brief moment, her hand resting lightly against the surface, her gaze softening just enough to acknowledge the distance she had traveled. There was no need for closure, no need for finality, because what had ended had already served its purpose, and what remained was not defined by it. And as she turned off the light and stepped away, the room settling into stillness behind her, there was a quiet understanding that the most powerful transformations do not announce themselves with noise or spectacle. They unfold in silence, in patience, in the deliberate choice to become something more without needing to prove it to anyone else. And as the night deepened and the city continued its endless movement, two paths moved forward in parallel, no longer intersecting, no longer defined by the same narrative, one shaped by the recognition of what had been overlooked, the other by the quiet certainty of what had been built. And in that separation, there was no bitterness, no unfinished tension, only a clarity that allowed both to continue without needing to look back, because the most significant truth had already been revealed, not in words, not in confrontation, but in the undeniable reality that what is built with understanding will always outlast what is built to be seen. And as the final lights of the evening reflected across the glass of the city, that truth remained, steady, unchanging, and entirely beyond the need for recognition.